Now, if you can remember this, when and where was your first encounter with the David Susskind Show?
Well, growing up in the 1960s and 70s in the New York area, the Susskind Show was on in my house and a lot of homes on Sunday night. And it always felt like a bit of forbidden fruit. There would be people talking on there, talking about sex very often, or just controversial figures. You can never forget the image of David Susskind interviewing a hitman with a ski mask over his head. I mean, it was no one. Now you have to remember, this is 1973, and no one had really done anything like that, and it was very dramatic, and it was not scripted television. It was an interview, but there was a certain showmanship to it, and the fact that it was on late at night, it just made it feel like a provocative place where people were talking about adult things.
From KCSB in Santa Barbara and Colin Marshall Radio, I'm Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas, and today I'm speaking with Stephen Battaglio, the business editor for TV Guide magazine and the author of a biography on a man I consider to be the original king of in-depth, long-form television conversation, David Susskind. It's called David Susskind, A Televised Life, and you've already hit on one of the interesting dualities, I guess I'll call it, about David Susskind's interview program, which is that there is this forbidden fruit element. There is the fact that he talked about sex and talked about violence and crime and talked about things on the edge socially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. But then people also seem to remember him as the purveyor of super highbrow talk as well. I mean, do you consider this a half and half sort of breakdown? Half sensational, half high tone, or how do you think about it?
Well, David himself was a very serious guy. I mean, he went to Harvard in the 1940s, graduated in 1942, and then went into show business. Now, today, it's not so unusual for show business people to have graduated from Ivy League schools, and Harvard especially. But back then, it was unusual. And David had thought about being an academic, but he also understood people in the tent. And there was a Carnival Barker element to everything that he did, no matter how high-minded it was. He knew that you had to get people to watch. One interesting aspect of David's early life, when he was at Harvard, he was also working as a candy vendor part-time at a burlesque house in Boston. He really sort of understood what an audience wanted through that experience.
There's this makeup that he has. It's so tempting to say this has been completely lost in the world of television, that there will never be somebody with these dual sensibilities or with this specific kind of background in TV talk again. Is it realistic to say that? Is it unrealistic to say that?
David came along at a time when television was expanding and growing. It was still new, and the public didn't have very many choices. And programming, too, was a challenge. David started his talk show in 1958 on a independent station that was out of Newark, New Jersey. It eventually became the PBS station for the New York market. But back in 58, it was WNTA. And if you weren't a network affiliate back then, there weren't a lot of places for you to get programming. You could run old movies, or you can run repeats, or you can get sort of a lot of cheap stuff that had already run somewhere else. But in terms of original programming, that was expensive, and that was difficult to find. And therefore, anybody who can get on TV and talk, which is a very cheap form of original programming, fresh, new original programming. If you could put someone in front of a camera and you have the gift of gab, you could do pretty well for yourself. And that's really how David Susskind was pulled into it. The people who ran WNTA knew him. He was known in the industry as being sort of a gadfly, a provocateur, someone who would rant about the state of television, about there should be more quality television, and because that was the business that he was in. And the fact that he was so great with a quote, whether he was on an interview show or talking to a reporter, gave people the idea that he could do a talk show of his own. They even told him, look, David, you can go on as long as you want. We'll put you on 10 o'clock at night, and if it's interesting conversation, you can go as long as you want, and until we shut the station down. If you think it's boring, then wrap it up whenever you want. And so the show was called Open End. And a lot of times the conversation would go into the night, 2-3 hours. And David drew on the people that he knew in the business, really, writers, directors, actors, people from Broadway, journalists. And it became a salon almost, where they could just talk about whatever was going on at the time. So I think it was a combination of the time that it was, that TV was so new. And when new technology comes along, that's when experimentation is at its height.
In the open-end days, the open-end years, I mean, you mentioned, of course, he had a set start time, but he could go as long as he wanted to, as long as the guests wanted to. He could go 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours, almost 4 hours, I believe, in the case of Richard Nixon's appearance. And that is the fact that drew me to want to learn more about David Susskind, because in that specific element of the show, when he started it, that it could go as long as he wanted it to go, as long as he could take it. I mean, what does that require of a host? What did Susskind need to bring it to the game to make that happen well, to make that happen compellingly?
Well, he was a natural on television. He liked to talk. He just liked talking all the time. He was a great storyteller, and he was he had this type of life where, he had so much production going on. So he knew so many actors. He knew so many people. He could bring them in, and he knew that television was a way also to get people to be in business with him. There was something very appealing about you could be a Broadway playwright or a novelist, and TV was new. It was a way to make you more famous than ever in a big hurry. So I think David understood that and was able to draw a great guest in, and it was just it was that ability to bring people to the table, and to not be afraid also to just go through a range of subjects over the course of a show. There was a certain intimacy about the program. It was almost like a cocktail party in New York. And if you even see photos and the rare footage of those early shows, they're sitting around. The guests are sitting around a round coffee table, and there's tableware, and there are carafes, and there's cigarettes. There's even a plate of sandwiches occasionally. So people probably didn't even realize that they were on camera. It was such a relaxed atmosphere that you could see how they could go on. And it was really like sitting around a table at Sardi's restaurant, where David hung out quite a bit, the restaurant in the theater district in New York City. And it became the place to be, because it was, even though it wasn't certainly the highest rated show in New York, again, there were so few choices and it was a tableau that you immediately recognized. People sitting around a table, that black background, maybe a few Klieg lights. It was an image that became sort of iconic in a short time, and I think that's what drew people to it.
Now, tell me about watching the early open-end shows, the ones that could go on for a while, because I assume, reading this book, it's easy to see you've gotten quite familiar indeed with what remains in the archive of David Susskind's programs. And watching these shows just from the modern perspective you have, you know, if I went up to somebody and pitched a show that goes on, could go for 4 hours, they would tell me I was nuts, but
they would laugh you out of the room.
Yes. So what's it like watching these shows, the ones that go on? I mean, you write for TV Guide, you know TV well. What's it like?
Well, first of all, it's hard. There aren't very many that exist. Back in the in the 50s and 60s, a big reel of 2-inch videotape was expensive, and after you ran the show, you did what they called degaussing it. You basically erased it so you could use the tape again. Nobody thought these things would have any value in the future, and certainly any historic value. And there are many other shows where this is an example. I mean, just great conversations with important people in the culture are wiped out. So very little of David Susskind's early shows exist. I've seen clips of them. I have heard audio of some of the programs. A fair amount of that exists. I mean, I listened to the 3-hour and 45-minute interview with Richard Nixon, but there are more. There are those interesting shows where David. I mean, it was right. There was one I heard that was right after the 1960. Conventions, political conventions. I forget if it was a Republican or the Democratic one, but David was in Los Angeles and he was with Shelley Winters and a professor from UCLA, I believe, Pamela Mason, the wife of actor James Mason, who was something of a personality at the time, Steve Allen, and it was right after the conventions, and you're listening to them talk about how dismayed they were that they had to choose between Nixon and Kennedy in the 1960 campaign, and how, why can't we get a man like Roosevelt in there, and just sort of talking about the dismal choices and how the political process is sort of demeaning at this point, and we really aren't getting the type of candidates that we need, and they really could be talking about today. I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing, is that, the things, people, you sort of watch cable news today and you sort of get a sense that society is going to hell when you watch it for any amount of time. And people were saying the same thing 50 years ago. I mean, that was sort of fascinating how the disenchantment with the now was sort of a constant feeling that people had about American society, and sort of almost a wistfulness for the way some ideal of how things used to be. That was very much in evidence in those programs. In terms of the pace, it was a more leisurely time. I mean, I think people took time to express themselves and to stop and think, and people were reading more books, and there weren't quite as many distractions as there were. So you do get a better sense. I mean, people aren't talking weren't talking as much in quick sound bites, and their personalities really sort of unfold on these shows.
Here's a clip from the David Susskind Show in 1977 featuring Dick Cavett, Phil Donahue, and Stanley Siegel talking about the art of the talk show.
What makes for a success of a talk show? I guess we started so long ago, it was almost like a new form back then. I don't want to tell you the year. But there weren't talk shows. There was Meet the Press. There were issues and answers. But there weren't talk shows where you sat down with anyone from Dick Cavett and Mr. Donahue and Mr. Siegel to drug addicts or reformed drunks or divorcees. There was no such thing. But now the pressures are enormous, right? Ratings and competition and get the star. You were very unhappy in your ABC career. I remember you were expressing yourself.
Happy?
Unhappy.
Oh, yeah, unhappy. Well, no, I was delirious a lot of the time by the fact that I was on television and couldn't believe it. And at the same time, I had a lot of problems with them. But the fact is, in general, oddly enough, I remember it as a happy 7 years in that I was on and a lot happened and so on. But day to day, there were pressures, problems, rating problems. Why don't you get Carol Burnett instead of John Cheever? And I would say, but can't I get both? You know, and say, well, yes, but put him on later. That sort
Quarter
of
of one.
And I'd like a show that can welcome both Carol Burnett and John Cheever, and there seemed to be some argument as to, there was always that kind of thing. There were some censorship problems and so on. Anytime you're doing anything 5 days a week on television, I think it's a nightmare by definition, but also terribly pleasurable, even at the worst times.
I think everybody should have one of these. I think it's really, I think it's an education which is available in no university. You see a broader slice of life. I go to lunch with Muhammad Ali, Billy Graham, atheists, people running for president, people coming out of jail, going to jail. Sometimes they're the same people. And I'll never take this for granted. I get a lot of attention. I get my name on television every day. People ask me for my autograph. The money's good. Get a table in a restaurant. I will never forget what's happened to me over the last 10 years. I've changed personally, philosophically, in many, many ways.
Grown?
I hope so. It'd be better, I think, if somebody else made that point. But I think I have.
Stanley, you do a unique kind of thing on television. You...
Say there's an audience.
I forgot to say, Stanley, I'm coming right back. I forgot to say that for one of the rare times, we have an audience present.
Right. That's not the crew laughing at Stanley.
That's not the crew. Those are people that are aficionados of Mr. Cabot, Mr. Donahue, or Mr. Siegel.
All of us, I hope.
Or all of you. Coming back to the question, you started 2 years ago one of the strangest talk show operations I've ever seen, where you let your psyche hang out, where you reveal the most personal problems or dilemmas or irritations. You're different from the rest of us.
Well, what I've done, to be specific, every Wednesday we have Dr. Elizabeth Thorne to come on our show, and she's a psychoanalyst. And I get on the couch and talk about personal problems.
I've seen that.
And that's what you're talking about. Now, what I'm trying to do, David, is to take a chance in television. I know that Dick is taking a chance, and Phil, and certainly you are. But I'm taking a personal kind of chance. I think that what talk shows should be about are feelings. I think that's what television should be about. We have enough information. But I think I'm willing to say what I feel. If I have a dilemma with a girl or a personal problem or I don't feel very well, I am willing to do that. So I think that is what our show is about, and that particular segment that you're talking about where I get on the couch is that. Last December 31st, for example, I had no date. And that was New Year's Eve night. And I got on the couch and announced it. I said, I have no date. I'm very unhappy. That's right, Phil. I had no date, unlike you. And I said, I have no place to go. And Hal Prince called that night and said, you must come to my party. Now, this New Year's Eve, I intend to have a date. But
even if it's with Dr. Thorne.
But the point of doing that... the point of doing that is this, though. It is not just to be narcissistic, but it is to show people that Stanley Siegel or somebody on television is very much like they are. You see what I mean? I feel I should take a chance on television and pick universal problems, which I think we all have, after all. To understand one man is to understand them all. And a lot of people don't have dates New Year's Eve or whatever. So my problems are general problems, and if I reveal them, I think everyone is better off. That's what our show is about.
How did it make people feel any better that when you say, I don't have a date, you get to go to Hal Prince's party, but they just have to sit home and think, well, I still don't have a date.
Yeah, you're right about that. No, but I'm not a missionary, but I'm trying to be honest, and that's the point of all this. I have a great advantage, and Phil is right.
Am I?
Well, John Denver said if you get a chance to do a talk show or a television show, you should take the chance, and he's right about it. It is a great experience.
Well, everyone will have the chance eventually. I think Mort Saul proved statistically that by 1993, everyone will have his own talk show the way it's going. And practically everybody you can think of has had one, and it's pyramiding, you know.
But is nothing sacred? I mean, I would feel feel abashed.
Why would you?
Well, I've heard you say, let me see. You'd like to kill your mother. You have a girlfriend who is having multiple affairs.
And how can you say these things on television?
Well, now, wait a minute. I guess I can't deny. I did say some of these things, but...
You said something about her buying a piece of equipment recently about which you took a dim view.
Oh, you're making this up now.
No. Am I telling you the truth?
Yes, you are.
What?
But can I explain?
I mean,
well, yeah. Is there an
These
explanation?
are true stories, but I must tell you that that is true. But aren't these going off? The experiences going on in the lives of a lot of people? Don't we all have ambivalence about our mothers or fathers? Don't we have these general problems?
Aren't those private issues?
Why shouldn't we talk about them on television? Seriously, that's my point. You ask what is the definition of a good talk show? It's speaking the truth. That is the real definition. You could take any guest and ask him really good questions, or ask him what he or she knows about, and you'll have a good talk show.
What would you do with Phil Donahue if he
What
were
I would do with him is precisely what I did
What
with him when he
sense
came on
do
the
you
show.
have of the place that David Susskind had in the sort of cultural sphere of at least the time of his show's heyday? You know, what for those in the audience, most of whom will not have been around for the heyday of David Susskind, what was his territory? I mean, what would people look to him for?
David Susskind in the 1950s was a very prolific live TV producer, and he was also sort of the class act in television. He did things bigger and better than most other TV producers. He loved theater. He loved British actors. He brought many of them onto American television for the first time. Sir Laurence Olivier, Sir John Gielgud, a young Richard Burton, Richard Harris, many other lesser-known names, but very good actors. And he brought many literary adaptations to the small screen. He would do productions of A Tale of Two Cities or Ethan Frome or other works that were truncated quite a bit for television, but for many young people growing up in that time, this was a window into the world of ideas and literature through television. I mean, David Susskind did that because he had a love for it himself. He was so prolific, and you just knew that when you were getting a David Susskind show on TV in the 50s, that when you saw his name in the newspaper listings or in the advertisements, you expected a certain level of quality, just the production design and the original scoring and the actors, because he was a perfectionist in that respect, and he really delivered some memorable, terrific programs during those early years of television. It changed in the 1960s when live television went away and New York production really moved out to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, where the film studios took it over. And David had great disdain for Hollywood, probably because had he gone out there, he just would have been another producer. He wouldn't have been the king of production that he was in New York. But as a result, the 1960s, he made some very interesting television shows, and I think a lot of it was informed by his talk show. He would talk about issues on his TV show, the civil rights movement, social problems such as drug addiction, prostitution. I mean, things he would explore the fringes of society on his talk show, and as a result, he wasn't afraid of trying to present that in a dramatic way, too. A very important show that he did in the 1960s was called East Side, West Side for CBS. It was a drama series that starred George C. Scott as a social worker, a crusading social worker. And this show just went after every single social ill of the time and a lot of urban issues, too. He cast Cicely Tyson on the show, and she was the first black actress to have a regular show a regular role on a drama series. It made the series very controversial because of the content that they took on. I mean, these were very realistic stories about the human condition that didn't have a happy ending. And it was a fight to keep it on the air. And David Susskind loved the fight. I think he loved controversy. I think he knew that controversy meant attention. He saw that through his TV show, through his talk show. And he saw that through the shows that he tried to put on as well.
When we talk about a guy who had the talk show, with all this discussion of important social issues, with long-form conversation with important people in politics, in culture, in the arts. And when we talk about his productions, the East Side, West Sides of the world, or the theater productions he would put on live television, you say that to somebody these days, and they would think of David Susskind as a total creature of public television. Like, this is the kind of thing that people think of as being on public television, but he was only that later on, right? I mean, he was commercial TV and commercial TV only for a long while, correct?
Correct. And the thing is that, I don't think that David Susskind was a snob. I mean, I think what he wanted was the public to have a choice. He understood that they were going to want to see Westerns and detective shows and game shows and sitcoms. But he also thought that, why not devote some time to having, John Gielgud on, doing Shakespeare soliloquies or some sort of, classic presentation of fine literature, adapting shows, and something a little bit more high-minded. He knew that wasn't going to be number one in the ratings, but the fact that you could do it, he thought was important, and that the public should just have that choice once in a while. I mean, that type of television that he was doing was dead through in the 1960s until 1966, when he got Death of a Salesman onto CBS, the Arthur Miller play. Now, you would say, well, Arthur Miller, why wouldn't the networks put something like that on? I mean, he's a very successful playwright, but nobody wanted, when he bought the show and put it on and sold it to CBS, nobody wanted to sponsor it. Too downbeat, too depressing. And finally, they got Xerox to sponsor it, but at a loss. But the thing is that once the show went on, and it was on against the number one show in television, Bonanza, on NBC, it got a great rating. And suddenly, and that's what happens in TV, is that once something works, other people will do it. And it sort of led to a renaissance of good, of fine dramatic presentations on commercial network television. And that led to the 1970s, when you saw miniseries and TV movies, and there were a lot of schlocky ones, but there were a lot of very good ones too. Presentations of historical works. Susskind had one of the best with Eleanor and Franklin, based on the intimate biography of Eleanor Franklin, and which talked about her marriage to the president. And so, I mean, so he really did open the door to putting on TV that was more adult, and commercial TV that was more sophisticated and went beyond what you would think as the lowest common denominator.
Now, you mentioned, of course, watching the David Susskind Show in the 70s, seeing it as a kind of forbidden fruit. Did you remain a watcher of his program until it wound up in 1986?
No. I mean, I remember it. I'll tell you, when I got interested in the idea for the book, because I was always interested in doing some sort of history of television. There really aren't a lot of great books about the early years of TV. There's a lot of things that are very sort of nostalgic but that will tell you about, shows like Marty on the Philco television Playhouse, or Studio One or Playhouse 90. I mean, there are picture books and such that sort of, are for people who were fans of that era. But no one has ever really sort of done a real narrative story about someone making their way through this era of TV, of navigating the early years of TV, and the struggles of trying to do good stuff and get it into a commercial venue where it could be reached by a wide audience. I did a story for the New York Times Arts and Leisure section about Susskind in 2001, when they started rerunning some of his talk shows on the Fox News channel, of all places. And it was there that I sort of got the full picture of his career and saw that he was quite a character too. I mean, he was a well-known womanizer in New York. He was always struggling to keep his business afloat because, as you say, yes, even though he did sell things to the networks, to the commercial networks, It was always a struggle. He wasn't very good at series television. He always wanted to do high-class shows, and the networks weren't always buying high-class shows. And he always spent more money than he probably should have on a lot of the programs that he made. And there was something in him that wanted to be an artist, and that conflicted with television, which is commerce more than anything else. So there was that internal tension, and he did all this through these times, and it was to me his life was a great way to just sort of tell the story of those early years of television and what it was like and how it evolved. But he's a guy who just had a terrific narrative himself. I mean, there were in terms of his drive, what made him tick, and his personality. I mean, it was the being a talk show host was really an outgrowth of the fact that he was just this exuberant, impulsive guy who just was really involved in the world and what was going on at the moment. And you have to also think these incredible times, the 1950s and the 1960s, which were so turbulent. He hung on for a long time. He did the show for 28 years, and it only ended about 6 months before he died in 1987. The talk show rarely made money. He did it because he knew that it was a platform that made him different from every other producer.
If you've just tuned in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest is Stephen Battaglio, business editor at TV Guide magazine and author of David Susskind, A Televised Life. If when the show is over you want to hear it again, visit colinmarshallradio.com for the complete Marketplace of Ideas archive, or find it on the iTunes Store, of course, for free. Just open up iTunes, search for the Marketplace of Ideas. Whether on colinmarshallradio.com or on iTunes, you'll have access to the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, completely free, all the time. If you have any questions, comments, feedback of any kind, guest suggestions, no matter what, send it along to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. That is Colin at colinmarshallradio.com. And if you'd like to be kept up on all things Marketplace of Ideas, consider joining the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list to get weekly updates straight to your email inbox with information on current and upcoming Marketplace of Ideas interviews, as well as other related interestingness on the internet. That's at colinmarshallradio.com. The instructions are very simple, right there on the front page of the Marketplace of Ideas section. Now back to the conversation with Stephen Battaglio, author of David Susskind, A Televised Life, on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. Now, a biography of David Susskind could go with any one of the things he was and lean on that. It could call him a pioneering talk show host. It could call him a producer of high-minded television, whatever we want to call that. It could call him a champion of liberal causes. It could call him a womanizer and, make everything else secondary to these things. But it seems like correct me if I'm wrong, but you've tried to give everything equal weight. I mean, do you consider any given part of David Susskind inseparable from the whole? Like you need each part to understand any other part?
Well, it's funny that you say that, because that's the tricky thing about marketing the book, and that the book is, and I think people just remember David for the talk show, and they don't really recall much about his career as a TV producer, and probably didn't know at all that he produced movies such as A Raisin in the Sun, Requiem for a Heavyweight, Lovers and Other Strangers, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. Was a script that David optioned, and it became the first really big film for Martin Scorsese. So there are a lot of elements there. I mean, this guy really led a very full life and varied career, and in terms of separating one from the other, well, you couldn't really, because David he wasn't a very outwardly expressive guy in terms of talking about himself. He was a little bit cut off, I think, from his emotions. And the book reveals a terrible tragedy that happened as a young man. David's father was mentally ill and hung himself, committed suicide when David was 29. He had been in and out of institutions, and David felt somehow responsible for that because he had allowed the doctors to take him home after apparently a previous attempt. So I think that was something that aided Susskind for a long time, and perhaps drove him, and at the same time made him fearful. I mean, and the work was really how he expressed himself, I think, in that he wanting to do things, wanting to have his name on quality stuff, on respected programs, but also wanting to have the wherewithal to get it done. I mean, he was an independent producer, and independence was very important to him. He wanted to do what he wanted to do, and to do that, you couldn't always have a big partner telling you when you could spend money and how much you can spend. So the book talks a lot about David's struggle to remain his own guy in terms of being an independent producer who has the freedom to do what he wants to do. But as you know, it's not always that easy. It's a business more than anything else, and there is a business story here in that how things get made. And the struggle to get them there, the desire to get them there, the tricks, the strings that you have to pull, and that was all part of David. I mean, I think he embodied all of that.
It's a business story, and it's a business that he seems to have been remarkably successful at, because he has plenty of projects that didn't surely work out the way he wanted them to exactly. And I think of the nadir of his experience, or possibly as being when his company Talent Associates was producing a Supermarket Sweep, the game show that was still on when I was a kid. I don't know if it still is now, but where people run through the supermarkets and sweep down things, literally. But I want to get a sense from you as well as of why it worked out. I don't know if worked out so well for him is the word I want to use, but how he managed to be so effective despite, all there is in the book, quotes from people talking about, oh, David was impulsive. He could be rude. He could be not, socially the way you would have hoped he would have been. Despite all that, he still got things done. What was the power there?
He was a producer, but he was also a great salesman, very persuasive and intense. He started out as an agent. Because one of his early jobs was as an agent, and that was basically finding material, convincing actors that they can do certain things. And he just had that intensity. He had this sort of in-your-face intensity about him. It was said that the word no was a start of a negotiation for David. And he just wouldn't stop. And until he could get what he wanted. Now, sometimes that would rub the people the wrong way, but there was a certain fire there. And I think the fact that he was that way, I think the people who worked in his company, Talent Associates, liked being around that. They liked the energy that he had, and the fact that if they threw out an idea, he would say, "Go ahead, try it." I mean, there was a lot of that, throwing stuff against the wall and experimenting. But again, David was faced with having to stay in business. And when you mention when you're mentioning Supermarket Sweep, that was a time where David's company was faltering. He didn't have very many shows in production, and some people even thought that he had sort of lost his touch as a producer. He become sort of less reliable, and he needed to stay in business. And somebody came in with this idea of doing a show where people would run through supermarkets and gather goods after they go based on how they do it in a pricing game, and it repulsed him. I mean, he was horrified by it. but he knew that, but the money he made from that show saved the company and enabled him to make Death of a Salesman for CBS and win Emmy Awards. So he knew that, you had to make compromises in some way. You tried not to make compromises on the work, but he knew that, if he was going to stay in business, he had to adapt to the marketplace when necessary.
Now, you have this view on television, and tell me if you think this is true. Does whenever someone wants to put something on the air that they can be proud of, does it always get taken out in the pound of flesh of a supermarket sweep, or of putting something else on the air that they're not proud of? I mean, is this a classic television kind of compromise? I don't know if it's the word, but a sort of classic television balance people have to strike when they're trying to make things they believe themselves are good?
Well, there are very few independent producers anymore. I mean, usually now, what made David different was that he had his own company, and these days in television, you are part of a larger conglomerate, a Disney, ABC, a CBS, Paramount. I mean, the studios are owned by the broadcast networks or vice versa. And so everything is a bit of an assembly line, and they're the ones who can put out, they can put out shows that are smarter and more intelligent, but also know that they have to put on, something like The Bachelor or bad reality shows or game shows. Well, there really aren't, that many game shows anymore. But the thing is that you do have to. It's a big tent, and you have to have a lot of different things in there. I think if David was around today, I think he would still sort of be concerned that even though the public has a lot more choices, that they still don't have aren't getting the opportunities to see the types of things that he made in his heyday. That's harder and harder to find. So it's very difficult. It is a business more than anything else, and yes, you can go work for an HBO and make a quality show or a Showtime that has or go to an AMC and make a Mad Men, make shows that appeal to a smaller audience. But the audience is paying for those shows through cable. I mean, it's a very different model, and broadcasting, requires you to be broad and perhaps not as sophisticated as you want to be all the time.
Here's a clip of the David Susskind Show from 1982. He's talking to David Ogilvy, the Pope of modern advertising.
You say that research is one thing, but homework is equally important. I mean, do your homework.
Oh, and it's so boring, and I flog myself to do it, but you've got to learn a lot about the product. When I got the Rolls-Royce account, for 3 weeks I did nothing except read about Rolls-Royce, stack of papers that high. Whenever I got a new account, still get them occasionally, read the product, learn the product. The more you know about the product, the better chance you have of coming up with an idea for selling it.
You need a big idea. You say in your book, I've had about 20 big ideas in a lifetime.
That's charitable, 20. It's not many, is it? But it's more than most people. You've got to get big ideas, and they're hard to get. And big ideas in all fields come from only one place. They come from the unconscious. Nobody's ever had a big idea by process of rational thought.
Well, but you described a big idea with the patch here. That sounded rational.
No, it didn't. I knew that I'd got to get an idea like that. I couldn't think of one. So I had a good dinner and a bottle of claret, and then I got the idea from my unconscious. I won't say that I was totally unconscious after the claret, but I wasn't at my best, except that my unconscious mind was working and sent a telegram to my conscious mind. There are other ways to get...
Did you ring up somebody and say, put a patch on the eye, I'll see you at 8 o'clock
No,
tomorrow?
I just was going to the studio the next morning, and I went to a drugstore and bought a patch for 50 cents. Gave it to Radkai, the photographer, and said, just put that on, take one photograph of that to humor me, and then go on and do what you want to do. So he did that, and that's what we used. That was a good thing.
That's not good. That's inspiring. Rolls-Royce, the only sound you'll hear is the clock tick.
At 60 miles an hour, the loudest noise on this new Rolls-Royce comes from the electric clock. I once had a big idea in my sleep, and it lasted 27 years. We were going to advertise Pepperidge Farm bread, you know?
Oh, yeah, the wagon.
And I had to get a big idea, and I couldn't think of anything. And I went to sleep that night, and I had a dream. And I woke up. I could never remember my dreams. It made me very hard to analyze. But I woke up that night and wrote down the dream and went back to sleep. And I woke up that morning, took it into the office, made a commercial of it, and it's still running. And what I dreamed, it seemed quite harmless, was an old baker in a straw hat driving an old-fashioned delivery van pulled by 2 white horses along a country lane on his way to deliver old-fashioned Pepperidge Farm bread. That's still running. I think that's 27 years old. Most people change their advertising too often.
You dreamt about a wagon being pulled by some horses?
Yeah.
And it had Pepperidge Farm on it?
Yeah.
My dreams have the wagons and the horses, but there's never any copy. You know, it's blank. It just says, when you wake up, think of something.
I know, of course, I know where the wagon came from. Until shortly before, I'd been living in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, among the Amish, and weren't any cars. It was all horses and wagons. It was a part of my life. I got something out of that.
I think of David Susskind, the talk show host, as the first of, what to call it, kind of a spiritual dynasty of television talk show hosts, beginning with him, following that Dick Cavett, who was on, of course, Susskind Show several times. Following Dick Cavett, Charlie Rose, who has had Dick Cavett on a few times on his show. And I don't quite know how to unite these three, but it seems like a lineage to me. Do you ever think about it the same way?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think David was really different. Because because the talk show was not the main thing that he did. He was really a producer who did a talk show, but his main business was creating TV and movies, and the talk show thing was a hobby, but at the same time it was a way to sort of promote the things that he was interested in, and a lot of times the projects that he was doing, and because he was not on a network, and was usually he was on an independent station in New York and syndicated on PBS stations across the country. He wasn't always under real tremendous commercial pressure. I mean, he could pursue the things that he wanted to talk about. Dick Cavett wanted to be Johnny Carson. I mean, Dick Cavett was on ABC, and he was a competitor to the Tonight Show, and they did not. And now Cavett looks back very fondly at his conversations with Lunt and Fontaine and with Gore Vidal and Norman Mailer, but back then they wanted to get ratings, and they wanted to be, they were trying to be a commercial show. They did not want to. Dick Cavett show did not want to be the highbrow show that they were back then, because it was never a ratings success. It was never a real competitor to Carson, even though they ran for a few years. Charlie Rose is not quite in line with what Susskind did. I mean, certainly the show has the same feeling, that black background and that floating in limbo look of the guests. Longer interviews, but not very long than you see most other places, and that wide variety of issues. I mean, you could talk about contemporary issues, but also interviewing people from show business and from culture. So he certainly has the mix, but again, Rose is more of a journalist, I think. David never admitted to being a journalist, or never tried to be a journalist, even though he certainly encroached on their area. So he's a different animal, but you do see elements of what David did, obviously, in a lot of the other talk shows that are around today. I mean, Oprah Winfrey is someone who very much uses her TV show to explore the things that she's curious about, to promote her projects, and to expand her brand, her name. That's kind of akin to what Susskind was doing on a much smaller scale.
And in both halves of, the Susskind of television, whether the talk show half or whether the producer half, you do see this. You see him pursuing, I don't want to say his own interests, but pursuing causes and pursuing subjects he cared about and being able to bring them to a wider audience. Now, that connection doesn't necessarily happen. Somebody in media follows their own interests and then it becomes something other people want to see as well. What did he have that united those two, his interests and the interests of his audience? I mean, what did he have some skill at broadening things out for them or what?
It was just that deep curiosity and just not being afraid to ask the question, to put a panel of gay men on the air in 1967 and talk about whether homosexuality was in fact an illness or not, and having men get up in the audience and talk about their lovers and sort of showing on television that these were people, and a lot of these were just, it wasn't. It was sort of a way to reveal that the truth about things that were shrouded in mystery to a lot of the public. You weren't seeing issues like that shown on mainstream network newscasts. Feminism, which was an idea that was abhorrent to David Susskind, but he was still willing to sort of give them a platform and talk about their ideas, and the movement really took off after it appeared, after its leaders appeared on the David Susskind Show, and that's depicted in the book, and just alternative ways of thinking, different kinds of therapy, and that was trends of the period. These are things that were, in this sort of pre-cable, pre-internet age, were kind of a mystery to the public, and David was never afraid to sort of confront that stuff. I mean, I think he always wanted to know what was going on, and sort of and wasn't afraid to present it. This platform, again, it was not on a network. It was on. It was really. Even though he had to get that talk show, it did have to get ratings. It was still somewhat of a protected area where it was really the whims of the host that could be pursued, and therefore that gave voice to a lot of interesting people that were not heard elsewhere in television. Now, it's hard to stay out of the way of publicity because of so many media outlets that we had back in the 1960s and even the 1970s and certainly the 50s. This was a window. A lot of people have told me that whether they've grown up in New York or not, that this was a show that sort of showed them that revealed a certain type of life. That was different from theirs. I mean, I got a letter from a note from one reader of the book who was an advertising executive who had grown up in New York and in Queens, and he said, when this show came on, it was these were people. Some of them were crazy, and some of them were were not. Were not so wise, but he said we often heard the talk of learned people that we just weren't going to meet in the schoolyard or the candy store. So I think that's what it was. I mean, I think that show was a window to a lot of people in terms of what was out there beyond the confines of their own lives.
Now, if we can say that the earlier decades of television, the decades in which it was certainly more of an experimental medium than it became afterward, if that was a setting in which David Susskind could thrive with the kind of thing he wanted to do, people can say, they can read your book and they can say, oh geez, where are the David Susskinds of today? I guess that world is gone. But I wonder if that world really is gone, because it seems like with what TV offers today, hundreds upon hundreds of channels, this would be the time, if any was, for a modern David Susskind to emerge. I mean, is that at all realistic?
I think that the pioneers and the innovators today are on the technology side. I mean, I think, you look at something like Facebook or Twitter, and these things are unleashing the power of free speech in closed societies around the world, and that's a huge thing. I mean, it's a magnificent power that these things have. Now Mark Zuckerberg is not a great personality in and of himself, but nor is Biz Stone. But what they've created has really generated a tremendous power and of ideas, and it doesn't have to do as much with their personalities than it has with what they've created. And I think that's where the innovation really is today, is enabling the viewer. Back then TV was really a one-way street. I mean, David once did a show in the early mid-1960s called Hotline. It was with Dorothy Kilgallen, the journalist, and Gore Vidal. It was on a couple nights a week, and they would take phone calls from viewers. It was one of the very first places where viewers could call in and talk to the people on television. And when it was right around the time of the World's Fair that was taking place in New York, and a new technology was introduced called the picture phone, where you would sit in a booth and you would see a video of the person you were talking to, and they tried to use this technology on the show, on Hotline. And so they had someone at Grand Central Station who would try to stop people and say, "Do you want to ask a question to David Susskind, Gore Vidal, and Dorothy Kilgallen on TV?" And most people would say no. The idea of because people just did not. It was just a different world in terms of being heard and trying to. And that idea, that barrier was so great in terms of the technology was still a bit mystifying at this point. You can't imagine that today. Now it evolved more throughout the 1960s, when talk shows, you had to have an audience, and you had to, especially when you had the Vietnam War going on and other issues, very divisive issues going on in America, bringing an audience in and having them to talk or yell at the host became something that was, that became part of, it was theater almost, and entertainment, and we still have it today to some degree. But it was a very new notion, and it was just of opening up these channels of communication to the public, which I think has evolved and continues to evolve to this very day. This is all in the book, by the way.
Indeed, it certainly is. But even given the technology, even given the fact that a lot of the innovation is going on the technology side, do personalities not retain some type of importance? I mean, I can imagine
they retain a lot of importance, and I understand the point that you're making here. I think what's going to be much harder, it's going to be very difficult for someone to be able to have that kind of clout, because we just have so many choices today, and and TV shows, even on the networks, are getting renewed with only 3 or 4 million viewers. I mean, small niche audiences where it's a The entire medium now is filled with niches, and you can go you can live a long and full life without knowing what a lot of these shows are today, but they thrive and have their own audiences. So the environment is just so fragmented that for someone to emerge the way David Susskind did, I mean, he would be if he was around today, he came along today, he would probably be, another guy on cable that a small number of people really, really liked. It would be very difficult for him to emerge as the type of significant cultural figure that he was in the 1960s.
Would that mean, and I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but would that mean, we're not getting any more David Susskinds because of the way things have changed?
We are not. I would say that unequivocally.
And finally, I don't want to make that a bad note to end on, but technology brings interesting things even as it replaces them. I mean, what can media people, to use the broad term there, what is there to learn from Susskind besides having this entertaining story, this fascinating story, an interesting business story, an interesting intellectual story, a personal story? Susskind had all these things in his life, but there seems to be something we can draw from it about making interesting television, making interesting media. I'm not sure what it is. Do you believe that lesson is there, though?
It's funny. Some TV producers have read the book and have told me that they actually, and they thought they had good careers, and they end up reading the book and feeling pretty inadequate.
Oh dear!
When they by the time they get to the end, when they see what this guy did, you can't have fear. You got to be. You can't be afraid to take chances, and risk is risk averse is the way most media corporations are today. But when something does break through, that's exciting. It's because someone was willing to put themselves on the line. So, and Susskind was certainly willing to do that quite often. And maybe it's because he was a little crazy, and by the end of the book, you find out that he was actually that he suffered from bipolar disorder.
Yes,
and and who knows how long that might have been driving some of the gambles that he would take. I mean, he was a gambler. Even off screen, he was a gambler. I mean, he would bet thousands of dollars on Sunday football games and would bet on elections and things with friends. I mean, so he was someone who was always willing to roll the dice, and that's what you have to do to break through to create something of value.
I've been speaking with Stephen Battaglio, business editor at TV Guide magazine and author of David Susskind, A Televised Life. Stephen, thanks so much for taking the time today.
A great pleasure. Great to talk to you.
This has been The Marketplace of Ideas, and I've been Colin Marshall. If you want to hear the show again, visit colinmarshallradio.com or iTunes. Search the iTunes store for The Marketplace of Ideas. In either place, you'll find the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive. Want to be kept up on all things Marketplace of Ideas? Consider joining the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. It's at colinmarshallradio.com. In the front page of the Marketplace of Ideas section, you'll find the complete, very easy instructions on how to join the mailing list for weekly updates on all things Marketplace of Ideas. Questions, comments, and feedback, please do direct them to Colin, C-O-L-I-N, at colinmarshallradio.com. It'll go straight to me. I'll read it. I'll probably reply. Almost certainly. Unless you're, weird. The website of Ben Althouse, the man who makes our theme music, is available at benalthouse.com as well. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you next time on the Marketplace of Ideas to serve up some more cultural conversation of the depth you demand.